fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree, it says. Equality does not mean treating everyone the same. Equality means treating everyone appropriately. But conformity, as we've heard in the previous two talks, is a powerful, pervasive force in Christian education, discipleship, and formation. And it's promoted by preachers and teachers alike. When I began my research, a then ordinand told me that she felt she was being taught to preach like a man. That was a good few years ago. Last week, another lay ministry, this time trainee, said exactly the same thing. That she feels she is being taught to preach like a man. So nothing's changed. And conformity is often imposed via the simple device of making people think that it's just them. They're isolated. Nobody else is having this problem. It just happens to me, not to anybody else. And those who do conform reinforce that message. So in May She Speak in the Name of the Father, I explore the ways in which women are shaped, silenced, and seen by the church and its theological education institutions based on my research. Even from the north, I was quite surprised that the statement of need for the Bishopric of London does not require anyone who accepts women's ministry. Which must make some of us a bit cross. And recently, a number of women have asked me, where's the hope for the church? Well, I want to suggest some possibilities. Back in 1985, a woman called, I think that's the next slide. No, hang on, I've missed one. Never mind. Can you go on to the third one? No? Oh, just leave it be. Go back to the first one. Sorry, I'm better when I'm clicking myself. Back in 1985, Nellie Morton wrote, "We empower one another by hearing the other to speech." That's a really powerful phrase, hearing the other to speech. We empower the disinherited, the outsider, as we're able to hear them name in their own way oppression and suffering. In turn, we're empowered as we can put ourselves in a position to be heard by the disinherited, to speaking our own feelings of being caught and trapped. And being together, hearing one another, gives us voice and power. So I want to suggest, first of all, that empowerment links to incarnation and to resurrection. I'll go into that later. The most significant thing that sharing together does is resist the untruth that it's only us, that it's only women, it's only me. Because when we talk, we find out it isn't. If you're not sure whether women coming together is powerful or not, let me tell you this story, which has got to be highly edited, but I'll tell you anyway. I've been pioneering some work with a significant group of organisations, which I'm not supposed to name. Until we began this programme, the women who work for those organisations had never ever come together without men being there. And over the first couple of years of doing this, the women began to gain their voices, to speak out, to change things as a result of the sessions. So when it came time for those in authority to approve a budget for last year and this year, one of the men who was sitting on the relevant committee said, "One of us should be there because we won't know what they're talking about if we're not." As though men have got to know what women talk about. So my research was underpinned by two principles. First of all, that women are other than men. And secondly, that women's lives are holy ground. Let me explain. Women are other than men. We're not little men. We're not quietly spoken men. We're not men who are just getting it wrong. And when our otherness is not recognised, it has real-life consequences. In 2016, a Prospect report showed that women's oversized personal protective equipment, PPE, sometimes significantly hampers their work and can lead to injury. In 2017, the TUC reported the same thing. Women regularly have to tuck in, roll up, tie down parts of their work clothing in order to try to make it fit. Next slide. Thank goodness we knew that before COVID. Otherwise, we'd have had terrible photographs of people with ill-fitting PPE getting bruises and scars on the foreheads and things, wouldn't we? If you don't know, PPE for COVID was designed around a standard male body, and women nurses, women doctors had to roll it up, tie it down, sellotape it, whatever it was. The fact that we didn't take notice of women's otherness meant that standardization put women's lives at risk. Asserting otherness is important. And women's lives are holy ground. Too often, our experiences are trivialized. How many times, for example, has someone told you that their refusal to accept communion from you or from another woman isn't personal? How many times, if we question constant praying to the Father, are we told that if it was good enough for Jesus, it should be good enough for us? And how often have we seen issues for women transformed into issues about men? The Epstein inquiry has become much more about who knew what, when, and who knew that they knew than it has about those women and girls who were so badly abused. Almost 70 women took part in my research by responding to questionnaires, and then 12 of them got together for a conversation day. And I can tell you that was a dynamic day. Women worked together to come to a common understanding, to make collective sense of our experiences of and in the church. It was also dynamic because women saw things that they hadn't seen before. One person said at one point that she felt uncomfortable talking only about women, and she wanted to include everyone. The conversation group tried for a while to talk about everyone. And then one woman was so struck by what was happening that she stood up and pointed at the notes that the group had been making and said, "Look what happens when we try to talk about everyone. The women disappear." Think about sermons. When we try to talk about everyone, the women disappear. There's power in women sharing, and power can generate courage and lead to revolutionary action, as we've seen. So it's imperative that women speak and are heard. The most commonly used word in the questionnaire feedback that I received was voice. Sometimes it was associated with the power to speak out. Sometimes it was the thing that was oppressed. Women's voices were criticized, corrected, and silenced. Predominantly, voice related to identity and challenge. And gaining voice was closely linked to developing agency, while speaking out is often associated with confrontation. Actual criticisms, you'll like some of these, actual criticisms included comments like, "Your voice is too soft," or "too high-pitched," or "it doesn't carry as well as a man's," or "it's too shrill and nervy," or "placider than a man's." And another comment following Good Friday service, where the crucifixion, as you will know, was remembered, was, "Women's voices are irksome to men. when they sound sad. Please don't sound sad. I was seeing in my real-life research Simone de Beauvoir's contention. When she was speaking about woman, she said, she is defined and differentiated with reference to man and not he with reference to her. She is the incidental, the inessential, as opposed to the essential. He is the subject. He is the absolute. She is the other. In terms of preaching, listen to this passage from Stephen Wright's book, Alive to God, A Practical Theology of Preaching. If a woman does have a quiet voice and is uncomfortable proclaiming a message from a high pulpit in a large church, yet has a clear call from God to share his word, would it not be better for both preacher and listeners to create spaces within the life of the church where she could feel at home, in sharing the word, rather than squeezing her ministry into an alien shape? At first, it sounds as though the writer's trying to be inclusive. But notice how the woman is characterized as quiet and uncomfortable in high pulpits or large churches. She is the problem. It's her voice that's the problem, and the church needs to accommodate her as the problem. The problem is not in the church and its misogyny. Not all my participants were sympathetic to my feminist perspectives. One woman said, I dislike feminist shoutiness because it puts me off. And another said, if we want to win people over, we need to be more gentle. If we use more feminine tones, men would take more notice. That comment despite 2,000 years of evidence to the contrary. Can you see what's happening here? Feminism is labelled shouty and assumed to be unjustified, rather than there being any recognition that women might have something to be angry about. And then, also, that women need men's approval. Men would listen to us if we were nice and if we fit their stereotype. Actually, we don't need men's approval. So where might the imbalance come from? That's the next slide. Yeah. Okay. This is just a quick graphic to suggest what the problem might be. The majority of ordinands are female. The vast majority of principals and deans of theological colleges are male. And so we cannot expect the colleges to reflect the kind of practical theology that women ordinands might need. The context of my first research was one of the early Women's Voices conferences. But I subsequently did another piece of research that was funded by Durham University, which to try and find out whether what my first research said was kind of anything like related to the truth. And in both pieces of research, women spoke of being together as empowering, as being great to hear other women, and feeling that they were developing a voice. There were comments like, I feel free to be myself. I feel uplifted and empowered. And several felt that the conferences, particularly in sessions about Bible women, validated women's experiences of God and of faith and of life. I think the most moving comment that was written about the Women's Voices conference was, tomorrow I feel like I'll begin my preaching ministry again. Today I've been given a commission to stand tall, speak as God gives me voice, to look at preaching as a woman as an immense challenge and privilege. I embrace my womanhood more than ever. Women spoke about the value of safe spaces where we're understood, where everyone wants to listen, to understand each other, where nobody wants to dominate the conversation. There's that phrase in practice, hearing each other to speech again. There really is power in women sharing. So the question for me was, what's happening theologically when women share? Why is it so powerful? Initially, things were a bit tricky because the phrase used by most theologians that I'd read or I was reading was one that's been thoroughly hijacked. I found myself squirming a bit the first few times I used it. The phrase is erotic power. It's got nothing to do with Ann Summers or sexy lingerie or any of those things. It means powerful liberation that is inherent in us all. Audre Lorde defines the erotic as a resource within each of us that lies in a deeply female and spiritual plane. Rita Nakashima Brock offers a more expansive definition that incorporates self, community, love, and wisdom. She writes, feminist eros is grounded in the relational lives of women and in a critical, self-aware consciousness that unites the psychological and political spheres of life, binding love with power. Eros is a sensuous, transformative, whole-making wisdom. Erotic power is the power of our primal interrelatedness. Liberation theologian Willie James Jennings, in his critique of theological education as rooted in white hegemony and homogeneity, offers eros as a way of overcoming isolation and building community. But it was Brock whose work seemed best to explain my findings. She explores eros as a powerful response to conventional understandings of power, which are coloured by our experiences of life in white, male-dominated societies. She defines the problem of male dominance in ways that are echoed in the women in my research. Male dominance means that male thinking dominates public narrative and common practice. We can see that in the way the news is dominated by men, the ways in which knowledge is regarded as either valuable or trivial, and the ways in which treating the male body as the standard body impacts women. And it's not just in the church. For example, it wasn't until 1993 that drugs were standardly tested on both men and women. Until then, they were tested only on men, and it was assumed that that would be fine for women too. But as a result of testing the same drugs on women, some of the key drugs, for example, sleeping tablets, were halved for women because it was discovered that, unlike men, women suffered cognitive impairment the next day. In Christianity, I think it's doctrine or theology, as Selina put it, that separates women from God by making God male. God is Father, Jesus is Son. God the Father symbolises male dominance. God the Son suggests women are saved by male action. Both are reasons given by traditional Catholics in the Church of England for not accepting women priests. In Jesus, self-sacrifice is made the epitome of love. So self-denial is encouraged, particularly by those of us who are not the same gender as Jesus. Crucifixion is interpreted to mean that death and separation are the sources of new life. Connection comes through disconnection. In church practice, women are separated from men because, by default, the standard minister is male, and the woman minister is different. Congregation members make conscious choices about whether or how to hear a woman minister and how they accept her ministry. I was once asked at the end of a service by a man, that sermon was so good, I've got to ask you where you got it from. does this make sense when the women in my research identified women sharing as a source of power? Brock argues that power is rooted in interrelatedness and is innate. The fundamental power of life born into us heals, makes whole, empowers, and liberates. This is erotic power. It unites us with our bodies and leads us on a journey where we discover mutual love and compassion, an incarnation of divine love. If this erotic power is present among us, and if it does empower us, surely it must empower our preaching and our ministry. If erotic power arises in our bodies and enables community among women, it must also be expressed in our voices. In the church, and not just the Church of England, we inhabit a patriarchal system from the ground up. We address God as Father. We believe in the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. Sin is often explored as pride, even though feminist theologians have known for decades that women rarely are proud and often think too little of ourselves. If erotic power is liberative, how does it resist the oppression of hierarchies like the church? How does it resist the systems that fix things in place rather than encourage exploration in theology? Recently, a particular man was chosen to be a new bishop. What gift did he receive from his own diocesan bishop? I'll do the next slide. Not a sign of humility or a reminder that he was nothing special. One bishop gave to another bishop a symbol of power, a crozier, the big stick thing. You just do the next one. There's another big stick thing being used metaphorically, but still to illustrate power. The only way that such patriarchal systems of power can be broken is by erotic power. And I think that is about incarnation. In a similar way to the way that we trivialize women's bodies by making them sexual and separating them from our minds and our spirits, we've trivialized incarnation. The word became flesh has lost most of its significance. In the incarnation of Jesus, God broke into the world of flesh. The cosmic system was somehow ruptured. God broke out of God's space into humanity. Christians might also believe, some Christians, that this is liberative love. Eros. And I think that reducing incarnation to a single unique event that took place only in Jesus limits it. It serves patriarchal power. When viewed only as fully evident in Christ, incarnation lays a reducing, restricting burden on the lives of women. Elizabeth Johnson says this: despite the potential benefit devolving from Jesus the Christ, of all the doctrines of the church, Christology is the one most used to suppress and exclude women. She argues that emphasizing the maleness of Jesus, which we do almost unconsciously whenever we finish the prayer within the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, means that women are excluded from salvation because God assumed male humanity. It justifies patriarchy because identifying Jesus as the image of God leads to attributing male titles to God. If the image of God is male, women are devalued. Johnson even argues that maybe in the churches there is an idolatry of maleness inherent in our theology. So I want to suggest that differentiating the incarnation, the enfleshment of God in Jesus, from a more general incarnation of the Spirit of God incarnated by moving through human beings is important. As ministers, we need to be aware of the importance of the Spirit, the female God, being incarnated among us when we come together. A broader understanding of incarnation explains the kinds of power that women experience. If the Spirit freely pervades the world, then she is free to move beyond patriarchal systems and work powerfully through women and men in erotic power. Incarnation is not limited to one male body, but is seen in and through all bodies. Where women's bodies come together, patriarchal norms and patriarchal theology are destabilized. Where women's voices are discerned and where the flow of patriarchal power is jammed, incarnation can take place among the bodies of women. And through liberated bodies, we truly see the liberating power of incarnation. Let me return briefly to an earlier point. Power shapes how we think and act. Systems of power determine what counts as valid knowledge. I am quite horrified by the number of people who leave theological college knowing what they believe about whether or not Matthew and Luke used Mark plus another source called Q, but have absolutely no idea about how women affected Jesus' ministry. And yet, in institutions across the Church of England, there is theology, and then feminist or black or disabled theology. We are a subset, not part of the main course. Our theological education systems, and too often our sermons, pander to rationalistic ideas and ignore the power that arises in our bodies, our deepest and non-rational knowledge, as Audre Lorde calls it. Yeah, there she is. Incarnation insists that bodies can and must be freed from such power dynamics. Incarnational space is beyond power systems. We enter with bodies as bodies, including flesh and feelings. Thus, I suggest that it's time for a theological move that relates erotic power to incarnation. But also in my research, women spoke of being part of a community of women as passionate, life-giving, where God is present, where I feel born again, or where I'm becoming a new woman. Perhaps indications that incarnation of God among us is more than that. I think there's an element of resurrection too. What Grace Jansen called natality, the flourishing of the whole person in this world, which is a different kind of flourishing from the 5 guiding principles. For Jansen, natals can start afresh, to do and be new. They're part of community, a web of life that's embodied and gendered. It doesn't take a very long library search to realize that resurrection is actually lots of theories of resurrection. There isn't one. So I want to relate natality to resurrection and say that both concern a new dawn, a new hope, and a new way to imagine the world. Resurrection, again, is not a one-off event alone. It's a repeatable experience for women who are freed from death-dealing patriarchy, even for a short time. It's to become new, to see the world afresh, and to realize our own agency. One of the first things I think it means is that we must reclaim the stories of women in the Bible. We must tell their stories and preach about their situations. Let's hear more about the matriarchs and less about the patriarchs. And that's why those 2 books exist. Let's think about our theological education too. We're not alone. Researchers in Australia, New Zealand, and the States have found similar things to the ones I found and suggested similar solutions. Ellen Blue argues that because women's experience of faith and ministry are different from men's, theological education and ministerial theology training should be different too. Women should receive better preparation for the gender-specific situations which they're likely to encounter in ministry. But she warns, progress cannot be achieved by pretending that difference in the lived experiences of women and men ministers do not exist. In other words, since the church is patriarchal, women ministers need to be prepared by their training to deal with it. Or perhaps to seek freedom first and theologize later. Blue asks, if the life of ministry is not the same for women as for men, and numerous studies and overwhelming anecdotal evidence suggest that it's not, then why should preparation be identical? I've suggested in my book that we should have spaces where women in theological college have time together to talk about how we're experiencing things, to discuss our issues. When I've done it in my own institution, the women really appreciated it. I've been told it's not possible. And yet, last week, I was behind the scenes at Edinburgh Airport. Post-COVID, the airport decided it needed to revolutionise its culture. So they wanted to consult staff. And they realised, a commercial, massive airport realised that if they wanted to consult staff, they would not hear women's voices if they had multi-gender groups. And so they had separate groups for different sets of staff. Imagine the investment. But in the Church of England, it's impossible, apparently. Let me tell you what's in the book. Lisa Isherwood wrote the introduction for me. And this is how she begins. In fact, I will find it. This book should come as a warning for those women who believe they've been called to ministry, as it is unwavering in describing the obstacles they will face that are based purely on their gender. So that's useful for that. But she also says, this is a wonderful book, which arms women who wish to proceed to ministry with knowledge, confidence, and ways to resist the onslaught of the patriarchal hierarchy. So that's the book. I'm convinced that actually women need to speak together. That's why I set up Women's Voices conferences, and I'm delighted that they're spreading. If you lead a church, make room for women in the church. If you have an influential role in a diocese, as Sarah said, make room for women in the diocese. But let's hear women. Let's encourage each other to speak so that we can have the courage to do so wherever we are. Thank you. Have you? Oh yeah, don't bother about that. Yeah. There you go, that's what Lisa said. And that's the rest of the It's a Wonderful Book quote. Oh, I have put my email again, like Karen, I put my email on the slide. If you want to get in touch, please feel free. And